The Jacksonian Era refers to the time period approximately 1825 to 1845, and it's called the Jacksonian Era not only because this time period encapsulates Andrew Jackson's 8-year presidency, but also he was very involved in politics before, and he cast a long shadow afterward. So this 20-year period, really in between the era of good feelings and the Mexican-American War, is known as the Jacksonian Era. So starting with the election of 1824, this was kind of a strange election because all of the candidates were from the same political party. At this point, coming off of the James Monroe era, the Federalists have declined and aren't really a major political party anymore. And the only major political party now is the Democratic Republicans, the party founded by Thomas Jefferson. So all of the candidates in this election were from the Democratic Republican Party. And 4 different men ran: John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and Andrew Jackson. So the vote was split 4 ways, and because of that, none of the 4 candidates received the required number of electoral votes to win the election outright, according to the rules of the Electoral College found in our Constitution. Nonetheless, Andrew Jackson received the most votes. However, when it then went to the House of Representatives to decide, since nobody won enough electoral votes, the House of Representatives actually sided with John Quincy Adams. Now, the top 3 candidates were John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Andrew Jackson. Henry Clay was the 4th, and so he was not one that was eligible to be chosen from by the House of Representatives. Now, Henry Clay did have a lot of sway in the House, and he used his influence in the House of Representatives to provide John Quincy Adams with enough votes to win the election outright. So, John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, became the 6th president of the United States. Shortly after that, when Adams became president, he appointed Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. This made a lot of people feel like there had been some sort of a corrupt political bargain, that maybe Henry Clay said, hey, I'll get you enough votes if you secure me a cabinet position. And Jackson and his followers certainly thought that there had been a corrupt political deal here. They said the election was rigged, and people were certain that the popular choice of most voters had been denied the presidency because of corrupt political dealings. So over the next 4 years, during John Quincy Adams' presidency, Andrew Jackson and his supporters started a new political party known as the Democratic Party, and that is still the Democratic Party that exists today. Opponents of Jackson began the Whig Party. So by the time of the next election, we would no longer have this one-party system that had dominated America for the past decade. We would now have a 2-party system again, but there would be 2 different parties than it was before. John Quincy Adams and his father were the only presidents among the first 7 who did not own slaves, so they deserve a lot of credit for that. John Quincy Adams had a very interesting childhood. He had actually witnessed the Battle of Bunker Hill when he was just a little kid. His father sent him to St. Petersburg, Russia, to serve in the court of Catherine the Great, the Tsar of Russia, during that time. And since then, he had served in a number of political positions, including as James Monroe's Secretary of State. He was the one who authored the Monroe Doctrine. As president, however, he gained a lot of enemies, largely because he started out the presidency with a lot of the voters thinking that he didn't belong there, that he had kind of stolen the election. Adams further alienated the followers of Jackson when he tried to increase government spending and increase the power of the federal government. He asked Congress for money in order to fund internal improvements, roads and railways and things like that. He also wanted congressional money to aid in manufacturing and even establish a national university. Now, none of these are bad things to do, but the fact that he was asking for federal funds for it and not leaving it up to the states to fund it themselves, that is what people had a problem with. Jacksonians, or people who supported Jackson, they viewed all of these measures as not only a waste of taxpayer dollars, but as a violation of the Constitution, because they said the president should not have the power to spend so much in taxpayer money. The majority of taxpayer money should stay within the states that they live. In 1928, towards the end of Adams's presidency, Congress patched together a new tariff law, which generally satisfied northern manufacturers, but did not benefit southern planters. Without getting too much into the weeds and the details of that, this very much dissatisfied and alienated Southerners and Westerners, but it made Northerners happy because they profited from it. So the tariff was a very controversial thing. So by the end of Adams's term as president, both Southerners and Westerners were very discontent with Adams, and they viewed Jackson as a better alternative. Remember, this is the time of increasing sectionalism. And of the three sections in the country, North, West, and South, the West and the South were completely against Adams, and even part of the North was. If you count, parts of New York State and Pennsylvania, they were also against Adams. So Jackson ran again in 1828, and he won a landslide victory against Adams. They were the only two candidates this time, unlike in the election of 1824, where there were four candidates. Adams and Jackson both ran a very dirty campaign again. Jacksonians had really been fuming and plotting for the past 4 years, determined to defeat Adams and get their guy Jackson in there, who they believed deserved to be in the White House all along. So Jackson's party resorted to smearing President Adams and accusing his wife of all sorts of impure things. Like, for example, they spread the rumor that Adams's wife was born out of wedlock. And Adams's supporters, when they heard all these attacks, they retaliated in the same way. They stooped to the level of the Democrats, and they accused Jackson's wife of adultery. Now, Jackson's wife died shortly into his presidency, and Jackson never forgot that. He never forgave the Whigs and those who spread that rumor about his wife. This mudslinging campaign, while it was not honorable, it did attract a lot of interest. There was a ton of media attention. It was written about in the papers all the time. It's the kind of juicy stuff that people like to read about, to see nowadays on the news. And because of that, a lot of people were inspired to vote. In fact, voter participation tripled between the elections of 1824 and 1828. Jackson won decisively, landslide. He carried every western state, every southern state, and even some northern states. And a big reason why he won was because of his reputation as a war hero. Remember, at the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, he also had a reputation as a Western frontiersman. He was from Tennessee. He was a self-made man, born in a log cabin, kind of a rough guy. And this was the reason most people voted for him, because of his personality, his charisma, the fact that he seemed like a common, regular guy like them. And people did not so much vote for him or against Adams based on positions on the issues of the day, but based on personality. And honestly, that hasn't really changed much. Americans have always voted for people based on how they make them feel, based on personality, based on reputation, more so than based on policy. Now, Andrew Jackson was very different from all of his six predecessors. He was a very strong leader. He was strong-willed, and he not only dominated politics for 8 years, but he also became a symbol for the emerging working class and middle class, the so-called common man. So even though he had become super wealthy and was a wealthy planter and slave owner in Tennessee, he had this huge mansion he called the Hermitage. Despite all of that, he had the reputation of being a common man. He had gained fame as an Indian fighter and also as the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. He was from a log cabin, and he moved into that wealthy mansion, as I mentioned, but he never lost the manners or the personality of a frontiersman. They called him Old Hickory. He chewed tobacco. He fought multiple duels in his life. There was actually one duel where he actually killed a man, one of the only presidents to actually kill somebody. And he also was shot in a duel once, and the bullet remained stuck in his ribcage for the rest of his life. He had a violent temper. There was one time he and a friend got so drunk at a bar that they burned the bar to the ground. They started by destroying the furniture and the glassware and then burned it to the ground. So some say he was literally a madman, that he was not right in the head, but he was someone that the everyday person could relate to, the man on the street could relate to, and so they liked him. He also did not have a college education, unlike his predecessors. The era of good feelings marked the transition for the two-party era of the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans to a one-party era with only Democratic Republicans in power. Then the Jacksonian period marked the beginning of a second two-party era, this time with Democrats who support Jackson and Whigs who are against Jackson. So Jackson's supporters founded the Democratic Party, which is still around today. Jackson's rival, Henry Clay, was the one who founded the Whig Party. He and his supporters did so. Just to put it really simply here, Democrats favored states' rights over a strong central government. They supported a limited government or a small government. They were a fan of free trade, did not like tariffs, and they very much supported slavery. Whigs, on the other hand, were anti-slavery. They were typically very religious. At that time, the North was the much more devoutly Christian part of the country, not the South, surprisingly, but it was kind of switched at that point. Whigs very much opposed immorality, vice, and crime, and they favored a strong central government. Bigger government, more power to the federal government. Jackson presented himself as kind of the representative of the common man, of all the people, the protector of the little guy, the regular guy, and also he presented himself as a protector against the abuses of power that the rich and the privileged so often do. He opposed increasing federal spending. He also opposed the national debt. He interpreted the powers of Congress very narrowly, and because of that, he vetoed more bills than all of his 6 predecessors combined. He vetoed 12 bills because he did not believe that Congress had the right to make so many laws. He believed in small government and the Constitution in principle. However, he was willing to violate these principles and violate the Constitution in order to gain political victories. So it was all about whether or not his interests were being served. On paper, he seemed to be very principled, for small government, for the little guy, for the Constitution. But then, when it came down to it, he was willing to compartmentalize, so to speak, and do what he believed had to get done in order to support his interest. And that's why his opponents, the Whigs, called him King Andrew I, because they said he acted like a king. He expanded the powers of the president, even though he said he was going to do the opposite. The Peggy Eaton affair was kind of a messy gossip column type of scandal. A woman named Peggy Eaton, she was the wife of Andrew Jackson's Secretary of War, and she was the target of malicious gossip by other cabinet wives, other wives of members of Andrew Jackson's cabinets, and they refused to invite her to their private parties. I mean, this seems like a pretty trivial thing, something that's like on reality TV, but that's what people cared about. They suspected her of being an adulteress and gossiped and spread that rumor around Washington, and because the papers got a hold of it around the country, and she wasn't invited to things that she believed she should have been. Well, Jackson was very sensitive to this, not only because he liked Peggy Eaton and he liked his Secretary of War, but also because he remembered that his wife had rumors spread about her being an adulteress too. And his wife was deceased at this point, so this was a personal issue for him. So he tried to stand up for her. He tried to force the cabinet wives to accept Peggy Eaton socially. And when he did this, not only did the women refuse, but most of his cabinet resigned. They said that he had overstepped his bounds, shouldn't have gotten involved in these affairs, and most of them resigned. This controversy also contributed to the resignation of Jackson's vice president shortly thereafter. His vice president was John C. Calhoun, and for the rest of Andrew Jackson's presidency, he replaced John C. Calhoun with Martin Van Buren of New York. He was chosen to be his new vice president because he had remained loyal to Jackson throughout this entire crisis. Perhaps the most controversial part of Jackson's presidency was the Indian Removal Act. Jackson said that he was a champion of democracy, but his concept of democracy did not extend to non-whites. It did not extend particularly to Native Americans. Like most whites at the time, Jackson sympathized with land-hungry citizens who were impatient to take over lands previously held by Indians. Jackson thought that the best solution was to compel the Indians to force them to leave their traditional homelands in the South and resettle west of the Mississippi River. So in 1830, he signed into law the Indian Removal Act, and this forced the resettlement of tens of thousands of Native Americans. In the next 20 years, about 60,000 Native Americans would be forcibly moved from the Southeast to Oklahoma and Kansas. In particular, this affected the 5 civilized tribes, as they were called by the U.S. government. And those tribes you see in the map: the Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Seminole. By 1835, most tribes had reluctantly, begrudgingly complied with this act because they knew they didn't have the firepower or the strength to withstand the federal government if they were to come in and forcibly move them. So they reluctantly moved west onto the place designated as Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma. The Bureau of Indian Affairs in the federal government was created in 1836 in order to assist the resettled tribes in moving and in settling in Oklahoma. The relocated peoples, they suffered from exposure, disease, and starvation while they were on the way to their newly designated Indian Reserve. And this route became known as the Trail of Tears because thousands of people died from disease before reaching their destinations or shortly after they reached them there. Specifically, this route in the blue is known as the Trail of Tears that went from Cherokee country in northern Georgia up through Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and then down into Oklahoma. But more collectively, this entire movement of people is more colloquially known as the Trail of Tears. So as I said, from 1830 to 1850, approximately 60,000 Indians were forcibly relocated to Oklahoma. Now, some might say, is this even constitutional? Does the government have the right to tell an entire group of people they have to move? Well, no, it doesn't have that right, and it was unconstitutional for them to do so. And the Cherokees in particular understood that, and they knew they had legal rights to challenge this in court. So they challenged the Indian removal laws. They sued the state of Georgia, and the case was appealed all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, this is still John Marshall's Supreme Court. Even though we're in the 1830s now, and he started in 1800, he is still there, and he is still the Chief Justice, shaping the way we interpret laws. So John Marshall's court sided with the Cherokees. They ruled that the Cherokees were not a foreign nation, and therefore they had the right to sue. And then the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia had no right to use force within the boundaries of Cherokee territory. And this meant that the Cherokees could not be forced to relocate. Andrew Jackson was very upset with this ruling, and he basically said, I am not going to enforce it. Now, according to the Constitution, we have 3 branches of government. We have the legislative branch that makes the laws, the executive branch that enforces the laws, and then we have the judicial branch that interprets the laws. But Jackson, when John Marshall made this ruling, he said, John Marshall has made this decision, now let him enforce it. Now, this is a clear violation of his duty as the leader of the executive branch. According to the Constitution, it is the president's job to enforce the law, not the Supreme Court's job. So this showed that either he did not have sufficient knowledge of what the Constitution said, or he just didn't care. I tend to side with the latter position. I don't think he was dumb. I think he seriously did not care what the Constitution said. He pretended to in order to serve his own political interests. Now, Cherokees were able to hold strong until about 1838, when Martin Van Buren, who had just become president, sent the U.S. Army into Georgia and forced 15,000 Cherokees to leave their homes in Georgia. And when this happened, 4,000 of them died on their way to Oklahoma in what is the literal definition of the Trail of Tears. Jackson favored the concept of states' rights, but not if it would lead to disunion. For him, the preservation of the Union of the United States was more important than states' rights. And this view was challenged when South Carolina tried to nullify, which means to make null and void to where it doesn't exist anymore, tried to nullify a federal law. Specifically, South Carolina, their state legislature hated the tariffs that both Adams and Jackson had signed. And the South Carolina state legislature ruled that these federal tariffs were unconstitutional and therefore they would not abide by it. Now, according to this nullification theory, as it was called in legal circles, each state had the right to decide whether or not to obey a federal law or to declare it null and void. Now, we do not see that as an option anymore because of the Supreme Court rulings that happened afterwards. But nullification theory at the time said that states' rights trump federal law. Now it is seen as the opposite, that the states have the rights to do whatever they want as long as it doesn't violate federal law. But South Carolinians said, no, it doesn't matter if it violates federal law. States' rights supersede that. So South Carolina passed a resolution forbidding the collection of tariffs within their state, and this was a violation of the federal law. So Jackson responded to this by telling his Secretary of War to prepare for military action. He was prepared to send troops to South Carolina to make them submit to the federal law. Now, in order to avoid military conflict, Jackson was able to persuade Congress to pass what's known as a force bill, which gave the president the authority to take military action in South Carolina, but then he didn't do it. So he basically wanted to make a statement that he could use force, as much as he said he was for the common man and small states in the West and the South. He was making the statement that you can't mess with the federal government, especially when he's in charge of it. He also issued a proclamation to the people of South Carolina stating that nullification and disunion were treason. And according to the Constitution, treason can be met with the death penalty. So after his point had been made, Jackson convinced Congress to lower the tariffs, and the South Carolina legislature rescinded their nullification and decided to pay the lowered tariffs. So once again, despite his posturing as a small government guy, hero of the common man, he was always ready to use executive power and expand executive power and to use force in order to force his will on those who disagreed. While Jackson's stance on federal authority angered states' rights advocates in the South, they still did not turn on him because they liked a different part of him, and that was his stance on slavery. He was able to regain the support of Southerners with his strong pro-slavery stance. So he himself was a slave holder, but unlike other slave-holding presidents like Washington, who knew it was wrong and freed his slaves at the end of his life, Jackson was passionately pro-slavery, believed it was a positive good, and wanted to see it expand. And he actually used his executive power to stop anti-slavery literature from being sent through the U.S. mail. Now, this is a clear violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution, showing once again how he really viewed the Constitution despite what he said about it. So he banned abolitionist literature from being sent in U.S. mail in order to try to keep support for slavery high so that it would expand. So despite his claim to be the great protector of democracy and for the common man, Southerners knew that he would not extend this benefit to African Americans. He would not apply the benefits of democracy to black people. Another issue that Jackson had was with the Bank of the United States. So the second Bank of the United States, the federal bank that was still up and running at this point, though privately owned, it received federal deposits, and it attempted to serve a public purpose by kind of cushioning the ups and downs of the market, of the national economy, so that things remained stable. In fact, the bank's president, Nicholas Biddle, he actually did a pretty good job. He managed it very effectively. However, even though he was effective, he was not a very likable person. He was very arrogant, very had a lot of hubris, and because of that, people thought he must be corrupt. You know, he must be abusing his powers because we don't like him. How could someone so smug and disgusting acting? How could they truly do a good job at the bank? There is no evidence that he was corrupt. There's just evidence that he was an egomaniac. But this caused people to have the suspicion that the bank was abusing its powers and serving the interests of the wealthy at the expense of the poor. And Jackson certainly shared this suspicion. He did not trust the Bank of the United States, and he in fact said that the bank itself was unconstitutional. So once again, he's back to being small government when it fits his interests. So Jackson vetoed a bill that would have rechartered the bank and kept it open for coming decades. This was actually a popular move for the majority of Americans who believed the rumors about Nicholas Biddle and also thought that the Bank of the United States was only serving the interest of the rich. And this was going into his reelection bid in 1832, which caused him to win in a landslide. Despite all of his flaws, Jackson was an incredibly popular president, and he won 2 landslide elections in a row. After his second electoral victory, Jackson had to deal with the economic consequences of his decision to attack the bank. His decision to oppose the Bank of the United States helped him win re-election, but it had some pretty dire consequences in his second term. So Jackson, quote, killed the national bank not only by vetoing its recharter, but also by withdrawing federal funds from it. So it was really crumbling at this point. And as a result, both of his financial policies and of kind of feverish speculation of Western land, prices for land had skyrocketed. Prices for land out west had gone way up. Various goods became their prices became inflated. Okay, prices just soared as a result of this. So in an attempt to curb inflation, Jackson had an idea. He issued an executive order called the Specie Circular, and this required that all future purchases of federal lands be made in gold and silver only, not in banknotes, because the Bank of the United States, he said, was unconstitutional. This was disastrous for the U.S. economy, because soon after he said that all federal lands could only be bought in gold and silver, that meant that paper currency pretty much lost all of its value. And because not as many people had gold and silver as had banknotes, not only did their dollars become worthless, but also fewer and fewer people could buy land. And this caused land sales to plummet, and the entire economy plunged into a massive depression. And this financial crisis was known as the Panic of 1837. And Jackson actually himself did not really have to deal with this too much. The worst of the panic happened right after he left office, and his successor, Martin Van Buren, took office. So Andrew Jackson followed the examples of Washington, Jefferson, Monroe, and Madison by stepping down after 8 years. He then endorsed his very loyal vice president, Martin Van Buren, to be the Democratic Party's next candidate. And since Jackson was popular, Van Buren won the election of 1836. And he became the 8th president of the United States. Now, right as Martin Van Buren took office in 1837, the nation suffered that financial panic, the Panic of 1837. One bank after another closed its doors. People could not get money, could not buy things, were losing their jobs. The money became worthless, and Martin Van Buren did not have many good solutions. The country kind of just had to ride it out and wait for it to get better. And the opposing party, the Whig Party, took this opportunity to turn the country against the Democrats. They said, yeah, maybe you liked Jackson because he was so fun and charismatic, but now we have this depression, and it's his fault. And it's Martin Van Buren's fault. It's basically the fault of the Democratic Party. So in 1840, when Martin Van Buren ran for re-election, he lost. And the Whig candidates, the candidate that was put up by the Whigs, defeated him. And that guy was named William Henry Harrison. So William Henry Harrison won the election of 1840, defeated Martin Van Buren, and became the 9th president of the United States. And he was able to win because people were so dissatisfied with the economy that the Democratic Party, they believed, had run into the ground. So when William Henry Harrison became president, when he won that election, this established the Whigs as a strong national party. And from this point until for the next 15 or 20 years, really, the two major parties were the Democrats and the Whigs. Last slide here, William Henry Harrison, what did he do? Well, not much. He was actually a war hero from the time of the War of 1812. Remember the Battle of Tippecanoe, where Tecumseh was killed. That was him. He was the general who led the American victory in that battle. In fact, he was called Old Tippecanoe. And even though people had very high hopes for his presidency, they were not realized because he died 30 days into office. Less than a month after taking office, he died. In fact, he died of pneumonia. This was kind of his own fault because during his inauguration speech, it was very cold and very rainy, and he refused to wear a hat or gloves or a coat. And because of that, he got pneumonia. He gave a very long speech. He thought he didn't look strong if he was all bundled up. And because of that, he caught pneumonia. And he languished with pneumonia for about a month, and then he died. He was the first president to die in office. So his vice president, John Tyler, took over and became the 10th president of the United States. Well, what did he do? Even though President Tyler was a Whig, he was a former Democrat, and he really governed more like a Democrat, too. In fact, he vetoed national bank bills, the same kind of thing that Jackson used to do, and he favored Southern and expansionist Democrats during his 4 years. So some people thought he was a Whig in name only and really governed more like a Democrat. So by this point, the Jacksonian era was really in its final state. And you can see why it's called the Jacksonian Era, these 20 years, because even though he was only president during 8 of these 20 years, for the 4 years before he was president, it was right after he lost that election that he said was rigged, and he was building up a coalition to win again. And then in the 8 or so years after he left office, it was his vice president that was president, and then it was people from a political party that formed an opposition to him, and then an opposition president who ruled kind of like him. So this was called the Jacksonian Era. It was in its last state at this point, and it really came to an end with the Mexican War in the late 1840s, which brought about the increased focus on the issue of slavery because the U.S. acquired tons of land in the West in the late 1840s. And that is what we will talk about next.